broadcast via the Chamber of Deputies web TV. In addition to taking the minutes, I would also like to remind you that our rules allow our colleagues to follow remotely. Today, we have a hearing via video conference with the representatives of EgyptWide for Human Rights. This is part of the fact-finding mission on Italy's commitment in the international community for the promotion and protection of human rights and against discrimination. On behalf of the committee members, I wish to extend our greetings and thank you all for being willing to participate in our hearing today. So we have remotely Madam Alice Franchini, who is the Advocacy Officer of EgyptWide. We also have Mr. Ahmed Attallah, who is the Executive Director of Egyptian Front for Human Rights. And we have Madam Leslie Pikamal, who is the Advocacy Senior of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. I wish to remind you that EgyptWide for Human Rights was established as an Italian-Egyptian initiative in order to promote human rights and civil liberties in a country, which was Egypt, 12 years after the revolution, which resulted in the fall of Mubarak in Egypt. There is still repression against political dissent. There are multiple human rights defenders who are in prison or who have been forced to leave their country and to seek asylum elsewhere. EgyptWide for Human Rights has the following aims: provide accurate information on the human rights situation in Egypt, monitor repression by the local authorities, to denounce and report forms of violence, injustice, and exclusion involving this Egyptian society. In addition, they wish to support political processes involving the Egyptian civil society in its fight for democracy and freedom, and mobilize the Italian civil society on the issues of international arms trade and Italy-Egypt relations. I also remind you that in the latest presidential elections, which were held between the 10th and the 12th of December, so that's just a few days ago, the incumbent, the outgoing President, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, won against his closest opponent, the Social Democrat Farid Zahran. Therefore, al-Sisi will continue to be in power at least until the end of 2030 in April, when his new term will expire. In theory, this is his last term, in theory, according to the constitutional amendments that were approved with the referendum in 2019. And in light of the presidential elections, the Egyptian authorities have stepped up their repression against dissidents, preventing opposition candidates from even running, according to Amnesty International data. Starting on the 1st of October, at least 196 people were arrested for having participated in unauthorized demonstrations, for disseminating so-called fake news and alleged acts of terrorism. Now, Human Rights Watch has documented the abuse put into practice by the Egyptian authorities vis-à-vis asylum seekers and refugees, and this includes arbitrary detention, physical violence, illegal deportation, and collective pushbacks. I also wish to inform our guests that in the previous Parliament, this committee, and I was honored to be able to chair it then as well, this committee dealt with human rights conditions in Egypt. We held hearings with Rami Shat, for example, and Céline Lebrun. We also had a hearing with Leila Souyef, who is the mother of Ala Abdel Fattah, who is the very well-known face, as it were, of the Tahrir Square revolt of 2011, and who is the symbol of an entire generation of young Egyptians who've placed their lives at the service of human rights. I am therefore happy now to hand over to Mrs. Franchini. I hope you can hear me. Madam Franchini, I'm very happy to hand over to you. Hello, and I thank you very much, Madam, for your very thorough presentation. I thank you to the committee for giving us the opportunity to be heard today. Let me begin by telling you about the research work that we've carried out over the past couple of years on small and light weapons in Egypt, and I'll then hand over to my colleague, Ms. Peakman, who will tell us a bit more about the human rights situation at present in Egypt. So let me start off by saying that the Secretariat has our contact details. So if you wish to contact us, you can certainly have our details. And you're very welcome to contact us. EgyptWide has carried out some research work on the weapons sold between 2013 to 2021 in Egypt. It was published in March of this year. We decided to focus on the small arms and light weapons category because this is something that is very difficult to have clear information on. Now, since they are very small weapons and arms, it is difficult to identify them and trace them and track them during shipments and once they are delivered and then used, compared to larger weapons. And these are materials, of course, that are lethal, and often they are involved when there are serious incidents of internal repression, such as the ones that we've documented. So in order to do this, we had to use data coming from different databases, including the reports presented every year to the Italian Parliament on the activities that are authorized and carried out for the trade and import and export of arms, and also ISTAT, the National Statistics Bureau database, the WTO database, and the voluntary reports sent to the Arms Trade Treaty Secretariat by Italy, as well as the reports that are submitted to the European Union according to the Common Position of 2018. Now, this has allowed us to draw up a very thorough picture of the situation between 2013 and 21, more or less. And you must realize that there are some discrepancies, there are some gray areas in the presentation of these data, which is why it is difficult to track this all. And this is why this undermines the effectiveness of democratic control by institutions, even before civil society, the tracking, therefore, of the arms that are sold to these third countries. Arms trade is clearly linked to the political situation and the relations between countries. In fact, trade between Italy and Egypt is part of a packet of partnerships and cooperation. This is an effort that's been pursued by Italy and the European Union in the past 10 years, even though we've had more and more reports of these severe internal repression incidents and violation of human rights by the current executive branch in Egypt. Now, in carrying out this research work, we saw that there are some small arms and light weapons in Italy that were sold during that period of time, and they were used in these incidents of internal repression and violation of human rights. And we studied the time period in question, and we also considered the geographical distribution in Egypt. Most of these weapons were found in the Sinai Peninsula, so we think that they are indeed widespread. And this is why we have to keep asking for a stop on a halt on this kind of trade with Egypt. There is not enough transparency. This is in derogation of the principle of accountability in the use of force, and this is why each weapon that is exported can potentially be used to violate human rights very seriously. In 2013, the European Union Council submitted its conclusions asking for a suspension, a stay on the export of materials that could potentially be used for internal repression purposes. And Italy used, they exported these weapons for more than 260 million euros, which doesn't seem to be much if you compare the overall aggregate number of arms export, but the unit value of these SALW weapons are smaller than that of a frigate or a helicopter, for example. We've published 2022 data after the publication of the report, and we see that the trend is increasing. We have exported weapons for more than 72 million euros, so that's more than double the export figure for 2021. And if we exclude the peaks reached in 2019 and 2020, thanks to the export of the FREM frigate and the 32 Leonardo helicopters, then we're talking here about 2022 being, ranking fourth, starting from 2013 to date. So there is no reduction, no decline in this trend. What we are asking you is, and my colleagues, of course, will go into this further, we are asking you to consider the role of Italian weapons in repressing internal dissent in Egypt and in violating human rights there, because this trade, this arms trade, is making Italy an accomplice of the violations which take place on Egyptian soil. I thank you for your attention, and I now hand over to my colleague Leslie Picamal.
Sì, grazie, dottoressa Franchi.
Thank you very much, Madam Franchini. So yes, as you've said, we will now hand over to Madam Leslie Picamal.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Chair, and to the committee for hosting us today. We appreciate the opportunity. At the end of Egypt's so-called presidential election, today, the implications for the country of another 6-year term for Sisi are alarming. A decade of his unaccountable governance has driven Egypt into a human rights crisis clearly worse than under Mubarak. The security bodies practice widespread and systematic torture in Egypt, and large numbers of enforced disappearances with near complete impunity. We've seen an alarmingly high number of death sentences passed by Egyptian courts, including after patently unfair mass trials. Sisi has also led a vast crackdown on peaceful dissent, throwing tens of thousands of political prisoners behind bars in abysmal conditions, where dozens die each year due to abuse and medical neglect. The number of prisoners pardoned or released since April 2022 amount to about 1/3 only of the prisoners newly detained or re-arrested by state security prosecution in the same period. State institutions, such as the judiciary, that should protect victims and uphold accountability, have instead been co-opted by the executive and used to commit human rights violations. We see no concrete progress in the rights of women and girls, nor of any minorities, including the Christians or Bedouins, Nubians. This is noteworthy because the Egyptian authorities often claim abroad that Egypt is a champion of women's rights and of equal rights for Christians. We see no improvement either in the rights of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, nor in the rights of LGBTQI+ people. Egypt has no functioning open public sphere or civic space anymore due to the severe crackdown on freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, association, and of the media. Egypt ranks 166th out of 180 in the world in Reporters Without Borders 2023 World Press Freedom Index. Civil society is subject to a harshly repressive legal framework whose thorough implementation would end the independence of civil society and eliminate what remains of the Egyptian human rights movement, which is also targeted through sustained campaigns of judicial harassment. Reprisals and many other rights violations against Egyptian human rights activists have increased. laws and security practices, muzzling the freedoms of expression and assembly, prevent any political mobilization in the streets today. Economic and social rights have suffered too, as the Sisi's unaccountable governance has fueled Egypt's severest economic crisis in decades. The concentration of power in his hands and the lack of transparency and accountability have allowed the pursuit of predatory economic policies, feeding patronage networks, especially those tied to the military and the enterprises it controls, crowding out the private sector. Unsustainable and costly mega projects have been prioritized. Egypt's economy is now in dire straits. Acute foreign currency shortage and high inflation have left most Egyptians struggling to make ends meet. Social safety nets have proved insufficient, and popular discontent is massive. President Sisi is counting on international financial support to avoid Egypt's high risk of debt default. Yet he refuses to acknowledge his primary role in shaping this economic reality. He has made it clear that he will not change course. So we should expect more of the same from him after the West bails him out. In the shadow of the war on Gaza, the Egyptian authorities have been playing on the public's and the West's fears of instability, but this will not quell dissatisfaction and indeed growing levels of desperation among the poor forever. Thank you.
Grazie, dottoressa Picamà.
Thank you very much, Madam Pikamal. And now I'm happy to hand the floor over to Mr. Ahmed Atala.
Thank you. Regarding presidential elections, the Egyptian authorities committed many violations during the presidential elections. The violations show the lack of the political will of the current Egyptian regime to seriously promote human rights in Egypt, despite all the propaganda on this topic claiming the authorities are serious about human rights reform. The current electoral process showed the continuous systematic violations against citizens, political activists, and politicians as a way to silence anyone who opposes the current regime. The first phase of the electoral process, which began in September, witnessed violations aimed at preventing serious opponents from becoming official candidates, including physical abuse and voter intimidation, preventing from obtaining endorsements from the notary offices, hacking attempts and arbitrary arrests of dozens of potential candidate supporters. The state security prosecution has accused more than 128 members of one candidate campaign and ordered their pre-trial detention. One of the potential candidate and 22 members of his campaign were referred to trial on political motivations accusations, which is considered as punishment for his candidacy and his critical opposition discourse against El-Sisi. Preventing independent organizations from obtaining elections monitoring permits. After the government succeeded in excluding serious candidates from the presidential elections race, they pushed candidates who are little known or don't have genuine opposition profile to compete to give the impression that the elections are polaristic. The voting days last week also witnessed another level violations, such as presence of pro-government parties and representatives inside and in front of the polling centers to orient the voters, passing government employees to polling centers and pressuring them to vote buying and bribes, including the distribution of food and cash bonuses, severe media restrictions on election coverage, collecting voting incidents, preventing candidates' representatives from attending and monitoring the screening process in all voting counting centers. And at the end, the elections committee said that the majority of complaints are because of the intensity of voting process and crowding in front of the polling centers, and denied any violations took place. These violations that marred the presidential elections aimed to obstruct any serious candidates and secure the current president victory, violating the conditions of elections, fairness, and freedom. Actually, the presidential election should have offered alternative solutions for rescuing the country from its shrinking civic space and from its human rights crisis and economic crisis, allowing diverse voices and experiences to contribute to navigating this critical phase. This is crucial, particularly as the current political leadership insists on maintaining the same approach and failing to propose practical solution to the economic collapse. Yesterday, the National Elections Committee announced that President Sisi won 89% of the vote, and the turnout reached around 67% of registered voters. This turnout appears unlikely due to Al-Sisi lack of the popularity among Egyptians and their expectation of new economic measures after elections that will lead to more inflation and increase in food prices, contributing to further rise in poverty rate in Egypt beyond its existing high level. At the end, I would like to highlight several requests and recommendations. We argue to use all means within your power to halt the arms trade with Egypt, consistent with the provisions of law number 185 for the year of 1990, the Commission position, and the arms trade treaty, in light of the risk that arms sold to Egypt will be used to commit acts of internal repression and other human rights actions. We argue not to formally acknowledge the presidential election results in light of profoundly undemocratic circumstances in which they have taken place, and of the violations of democratic rights which occurred throughout the electoral process, and in general not issue any statement in any form that may be taken as endorsement of the latest presidential elections. We also argue to use the most effective means within your power to urge the Italian government to use Italy's important role inside the Council of EU and in discussion with the European Commission to push the EU to prioritize the accountability and human rights reforms in the negotiation for the new EU strategic partnership with Egypt, notably regarding the overall framework of the deal, the professional financial support, and migration and security cooperation. Thank you for your time.
Sì, molte grazie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atallah. Thank you also for having given us a picture of the situation after the latest elections. This is a parliamentary committee. This is the Human Rights Subcommittee at the Chamber of Deputies, and it was important for us, therefore, to have this picture of what happened at the election according to your perspective. Now, I would ask my colleague if they have any questions. We have MP Quartapelle first. I wish to thank Madam Boldrini for having organized this hearing following an election that, well, the outcome clearly wasn't very surprising, was it? Compared to what we saw in 2023 overall. And, of course, President Al-Sisi tried to prevent any opposition candidate from being well enough organized to be able somehow to beat him. We know that some Egyptians went to vote for someone else and not for Al-Sisi, and yet this is the outcome. Now, we've discussed the Egyptian Spring movement, basically, but I think we need to discuss this even further. because the so-called democratic explosions, which is what occurred with the Egyptian Spring movement, needs time to grow, to mature, as it were, and they need the right conditions in which to do so, and they need a political class which can perhaps produce a different electoral result. But perhaps things can be done differently. In other words, after the uprisings and after the first democratic elections, one might think that all problems have been solved, but we know quite well in Italy as well that a democracy is a very fragile state, and it needs, therefore, to be further bolstered to become a full-fledged democracy. Madam Franchini spoke to us about banning arms trade or export, and we heard this in the introductory remarks as well. There are some groups that wish to, some parties that wish to submit a joint resolution on the ban of these weapons to Egypt, the trade of these weapons with Egypt. And in fact, we did this already in 2013, and this resulted in a decision being taken by the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union. It was a decision made by Emma Bonini, who at the time was the Foreign Affairs Minister here in Italy. Now, with an increase in global instability in the Mediterranean as well, we need to think carefully about our foreign policy instruments, and this is an initiative which should be reconsidered, in fact, again. Now, I have a question. What other initiatives are possible for Italian foreign policy in order to support a different idea for the future of Egypt? In other words, what kind of support can be given to the movements there that are trying to keep afloat the opposition, and what kinds of relations do you think we can have and entertain with the Al-Sisi government? These are useful contributions for our committee. We would like to know what you think about this, and we can take that into account when we further our discussions on this matter. Thank you very much, MP Quartapelle. If we have no further questions, I myself would like to ask you something. First of all, I wish to tell you how much we appreciate the hard work that you've been carrying out. You've pointed out how important these issues are, and in fact, this is a very risky endeavor. I'm wondering, Mr. Ahmed Attallah, whether you live in Egypt or do you live abroad? Because I would imagine that if you were in Egypt today and if you were to denounce so explicitly these activities, it would not be very easy for you to keep living there. There would be repercussions, retaliations, reprisals. So I'm wondering, is it possible, if you are living in Egypt, to speak so openly about these matters? And what kind of risk are you running in doing so? I would also like some information on how Ala Abdel Fattah is doing health-wise. Do we have any information on Ala? Because we heard his mother. He was on a hunger strike, which lasted for a very long time, and in fact, he was supported by a group of intellectuals and human rights activists here in Italy, by many, many people. In fact, we also published and presented his book. I have a copy of his book myself, so I'm asking if you have any news about his health at the moment. And do you have any information on the conditions of the other activists who are being currently detained? I would like to know more or less how many there are today in detention, because you talked about thousands of detainees, but I was wondering whether you have any precise numbers, actual figures of the number of detainees. I would suppose that after the elections, with all the arbitrary arrests or detention cases, the situation might have become even worse. I'm wondering whether the International Red Cross Committee has access to these prisons to these detention centers? Can they get in? Can they visit with the detainees there? And what are the conditions in which they are living in those prisons? I also would like to know from you whether you are in contact with associations working in other countries, with NGOs, for example, that deal with human rights in other countries. Do you think it might be useful to provide support? Maybe through a protest in Egypt, to provide support in Egypt through some kind of protest. So can we show that we are in favor of your activities, and maybe international activists can come and show their solidarity and their support and backing. So I would like to know what you can do, what actions you can take, what difficulties you've encountered in doing all this. Now, we are certainly considering a resolution. Mrs. Quartapelle, in fact, mentioned this herself in her remarks. We will ask our government to stop doing certain things and to start doing others. Clearly, we want to put an end to arms trade with Egypt, and surely we would like to see, or at least ask, that these elections not be recognized and exert some sort of pressure within the EU so that they are not deemed to be free and fair elections. Perhaps we could also send in some delegations in order to monitor human rights, the human rights situation there. So we can draw up a parliamentary act, and it could contain these ideas, and maybe we could work on it together in a collaborative effort with you. And I will now hand over to you for a very brief reply on your part. Thank you.
Chi vuole iniziare?
Who wishes to begin?
Perhaps I could say a couple of words in response to the first
Leslie
question.
Pichemalla, prego, dottoressa.
Yes, madam. The floor is yours.
So regarding Madame Portabello's question and also Madame Bordini's question about what could be done, the options for action. Are you able to hear me? Okay. Yeah, so there are several options for action at the multilateral level, bilateral, and European. In any case, the role of parliamentarians is very important to urge the executive to act. Italy can support any joint statement or a resolution initiative on human rights in Egypt at the UN Human Rights Council. Italy can also use its role at the EU level within the Council of the EU and in any bilateral discussions with the European Commission to push for human rights and accountability conditions to be prioritized in the upcoming negotiations, which the EU is expected to soon start in 2024 with Egypt for a new strategic partnership agreement. This is an enhancing upgrading of the EU-Egypt relationship, and it is absolutely necessary for that to be based on human rights and accountability conditions, including for any funding and including for in the migration and security cooperation field. Otherwise, any EU funds will likely be misspent and misused and could serve to fuel human rights violations or to embolden the authoritarian rulers of Egypt. Of course, support to civil society is very important, as you suggested. be it human rights defenders, activists such as Alle and other prisoners of opinion. It's important to continue mentioning them, highlighting their cases, asking questions to the government, press releases, any kind of public visible action you can take on your side that will shed light on this matter, because it is not given the required attention. Regarding solidarity actions in Egypt, this sounds helpful, but I'm not sure to what extent it can be impactful from international civil society, because in Egypt the public sphere is very closed and the media will not be able to independently and freely cover, except for some correspondence of international media agencies and media outlets. Egyptian media will not be allowed to cover freely, except with maybe a small exception. And even that media outlet is currently being prosecuted. So this is very difficult. You can maybe provide more visibility from Italy, but perhaps the other colleagues will have some other comment or suggestion.
Grazie. E allora passo la parola.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy now to hand over to Madam Franchini for her reply. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the MPs for their questions. I agree with what my colleague said just before me now, and let me also reiterate that we are pushing to see more focus on human rights and transparency, and all this has to be part of any strategic partnership that we might pursue with Egypt, either bilaterally or within the European institutions in which Italy has a role. We're talking about cooperation on defense and security matters, or cooperation on migration issues and energy partnerships, for example, or industrial or cultural partnerships of any kind, any form whatsoever. Because this is a very closed society, very closed public system, as it were, government system, and there is great control over the society, both in the public and private spheres. This is very worrisome, and we have to make sure that these partnerships in no way strengthen the power and the non-democratic wielding of power by these governments, because this all has a direct impact on human rights. So this is important in order to support civil society and the causes of civil liberties in Egypt. It is also important in making our appeal for transparency and a greater focus on human rights. Now, let me say something very briefly on the work that we carry out with the civil society in Egypt, in Italy, and elsewhere. As you already know, unfortunately, in Egyptian civil society, there are many representatives who are in exile, not only in Italy, but in other countries around the world. And in multiple cases, they continue to work in some organizations and through the media outlets in order to bear witness to what is happening with regard to human rights in their country. But in doing so, they often are intimidated, they are threatened, they are under surveillance. Even in their personal sphere, their families are threatened. And this happens in European Union countries, including Italy, even in their place of work, for example, they are monitored. So we think, as a parliament, that you should try to look into the situation to make sure that they can enjoy their rights, they have freedom of expression, and they can enjoy freedom of participation, in fact, in the countries in which they live. Now, having said that, I will be happy to hand over to my colleague for his reply, and I will just wrap up by saying that earlier you mentioned an important initiative, which is a draft resolution of the Parliament on the ban on weapons trade with Egypt. Now, we would support this wholeheartedly, and we think this is an important issue that should be debated. It should be part of our discourse, and it should help to raise awareness on what is happening. Thank you very much.
Bene, grazie molto e adesso in chiusura vorrei dare la...
Thank you very much for your reply, and now I'm happy to hand over to Mr. Ahmed Attallah.
Thank you. Actually, I have been living outside Egypt since 2019, but some of the team members, including researchers and lawyers, work from inside Egypt. Regarding your question about the numbers of detainees, already after the President Sisi announced in April 2022, after announcing the launching of the National Dialogue and reactivation of the Presidential Pardon Committee, actually the security agencies continued to arrest people on accusations based on exercising their rights to organize peaceful assembly and express opinions. This number reached more than 4,900 persons, which is like 3 times the number of those released in the same period. Regarding the detention conditions, the Egyptian authorities don't allow visits by independent human rights organizations, and the Red Cross has not yet visited prisons in Egypt, including the prisons who have like a bad reputation, like Al-Aqrab prison. Although the Egyptian authorities recently transferred male and female detainees from all the prisons, such as I said, Al-Aqrab and Aqrab 1 and Aqrab 2, and Tura prisons and Al-Qanatir prison, 2 new prisons. Actually, the violations continue inside this new detention centers, including restricting their rights to visitation, exercising, turning on the lights around the clock daily, and ill treatment of detainees by the prisons officers. I think these conditions already more or less already happened to Ala Abdel Fattah in his prison. He already has been detained for in one of the new prisons called Wadi al-Natrun. Actually, this violations led detainees to commit suicide attempts at the beginning of this year, 2023, and also these conditions these detention conditions referred and mentioned by the United Nations Committee Against Torture during the reviewing the torture file of Egypt before this committee. Thank you.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you indeed for having provided us with this update on the situation, which is very, very serious. Of course, we already knew this, but now we're hearing it from you who are involved day in and day out. So it is even more impactful. So we will do our very best. We will be deeply engaged. We will try to pressure the Italian government into prohibiting the sale of weapons to Egypt. We know that Egypt is using those weapons against civilians and human rights activists and against the opposition. In the parliamentary act that we will draw up, we will ask that these elections not be recognized as free and fair elections, and we'll point out the issue of monitoring. As you suggested, we will ask that they increase the transparency and the monitoring efforts, and in all relations with Egypt, there must be a condition, which is to respect human rights. I thank you again very, very much. We will keep you informed as to any developments. We will be working on these issues together, and I do hope that you'll be able to continue your effort with the same commitment and courage that you've always shown, and I hope that we'll be able to raise more awareness on what is happening there and on these latest elections. I mean, after all, according to what we've heard, they surely have not been free elections at all. So we will try to give a hand to those who are fighting for democracy in Egypt. Thank you all. Our hearing is now closed.